Okay, thank you. So the workshop is now being recorded. So before I introduce all our speakers for today's seminar, Sustainable Development 5, Gender Equality, I would like to go over a few housekeeping rules. If you do have any question during the presentation, please raise your hands. And if you'd like to speak, please type also your question in the chat box. Then I will present it to the presenter so that we may present your question. As I mentioned that the session will be recorded and a feedback survey will be sent during the session on the chat section. And we would please request you to fill it out so that we may gain insight on whether this workshop was useful and how we can improve in the future. So as I begin the seminar here at the University of Johannesburg, we recognize the critical role that universities play in achieving sustainable development goals in line with the University of Johannesburg objective to create a brighter future for all. As we embed the sustainable development goals in all we do, for example, in teaching, research, engagement, and beyond, and the goals align with the held values. Today I am joined by a panel of experts. I have, as I've mentioned, I have Dr. Vaneshri Pillay from the University of Johannesburg Postgraduate School. And I also have joined today with Dr. Zamambo Mkhize from the University of Cape Town and Professor Elena Moore, also from the University of Cape Town. So as you probably have seen on our flyer, I will introduce Dr. Vaneshri as she is going to begin the session. Then we'll have Dr. Zamambo go second and Professor close the session. So before I begin again, I would like to go over Dr. Vaneshri's bio. So Dr. Vaneshri obtained her PhD in 2021 under the supervision of Dr. Ndaba and Dr. Gobet at the Wits Business School with a thesis entitled Biocultural Life Experiences and Career Orientation of South African Indian Women Engineers. During 2021, Dr. Vaneshri was invited to present the findings of her thesis at the Wits Women in Innovation Conference and featured in an article in the Wits Curiosity magazine. In 2022, she presented her first article at the International Conference for Gender Relations at the University of Aveiro in Portugal. Her second article was presented online in the same year at the Indian Society of Labor Economic Conference, India. Dr. Vaneshri recently presented the findings of a PhD at the Women in Utilities session hosted by Women Engage for a Common Future to an audience of female engineers in South Africa, eThekwini, and German, Hamburg. She is due to present a third article at the Barcelona Conference on Education in November 2024. Dr. Vaneshri recently facilitated the assessment of postgraduate research module for the postgraduate diploma in research supervision and is currently supervising a master's student at the School of Education, Leadership and Management. She is employed at the University of Johannesburg in the postgraduate school as a specialist in policy, benchmarking, monitoring, and research. So without any further ado, Dr. Vaneshri, you may begin the session. And I will be sharing your slides.
Thank you, Lauren. I think I can start. Good day to everybody that's joined us. Thank you very much for listening in. I think as we're nearing the 16th day of activism that will start in November, I think this is a very apt discussion that we're having. I do hope that you enjoy my presentation. I want to just apologize at the outset. I am ill, so if my voice does croak a bit, please do excuse me. So I did do a welcome to the attendees. Thank you to RCD for affording me this opportunity, and also a very warm welcome to my esteemed fellow speakers, Prof. Moore and Dr. Mkhize. I've read through your bios and I feel quite honored to be in your midst. So my topic is entitled The Engineered Dialectic Between Identity Socialization and GBV. And I'm going to look at or speak about the narratives of the lived experiences of South African Indian women who are professional engineers, stemming from the private and the public domain. So Hooks stated, you can go to the next slide, Lawrence, thank you. Hooks stated, to be in the margin is to be part of the whole, but outside the main body. This place, the margin, is where most women find themselves, socialized in cultural systems that were framed and founded within patriarchy, as well as oppressive regimes that further exacerbated societal perceptions of the role of a female. Being born into a family that dictates who they think you should be, and a community that never really fully accepts you as equals. So always in the margin, always the outsider. This was no different when it came to decision-making and opportunity, more especially when it came to education and career orientation. Mama 2003 stated that historically women have faced controlled options for educational opportunities and social positioning owing to their stereotyped roles associated with the responsibilities of family and community development. The stereotypes associated with what femininity and masculinity meant in society influenced attitudes towards women in STEM. This was attributed to perceptions about the identities and the roles of women stemming from past regimes of oppression, which created social meanings as a way of classifying people based on race, gender, and class. This was all research that was done by Hooks in 1989, Eka in 2006, and Karim 2016. In 2017, King-Miller reiterated that women have faced systemic barriers concerning their participation in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, in line with UNESCO's 2017 report, Cracking the Code, which detailed the challenges females faced in STEM, be it education or the toxic, misogynistic professional environments. According to the World Economic Forum Global Gender Gap Insight report of June 2024, I quote, women make up over half of the workforce based in non-STEM roles compared to only a third in STEM. And one of the main contributors to this challenge, has not shifted in a decade, has been, and this has been through cultural norms and the societal expectations that often dictate traditional gender roles. And this notion to date plagues places of education, namely schools and higher education institutions, and further is exacerbated in the workplace, especially environments that were previously, as we're speaking about engineering, we know that it was noted as a male-dominated profession. And we still see up till now in 2024, DOST speaks about that there is still a domination of men in these environments. The recent research by Perez shows that STEM cultures also articulates messages of belonging in STEM that is heavily linked to racial, ethnic, and gender stigmas that inevitably influence persistence in terms of, whether women stay or exit in the profession. The research that I conducted for my PhD looked at the lived experiences of South African Indian female engineers and how they navigated their identity in their personal and professional spaces, given the patriarchal cultural value systems within which they were socialized from birth, and then having to function in a male-dominated environment. My research investigated this navigation and what motivated them to stay, as most of the literature looked at why women exited. The research employed a qualitative methodology, and 25 participants were interviewed using a semi-structured interview questionnaire. Braun and Clark's 2006 six-step process of collating and analyzing data was used, and the transcripts were sent to each participant to confirm the validity of the information captured. The metaphorical three-dimensional space of inquiry was used to create a narrative for each respondent. Transcripts as well as narratives were coded, to form code groups based on code frequency, which were then collapsed and thematically analyzed. It was actually during this analysis of the narratives that evidence of GBV reared its ugly head. And most of the women spoke about their site experiences as horrific. One participant spoke about how a colleague of hers was dressing with oversized clothing to deter male attention. Another revealed how she was being verbally harassed by a senior male engineer who made lewd sexual remarks towards her because she turned down his request to have a relationship. And I think what was very concerning for me was that this specific participant tried to lodge a complaint at her HR. And the HR manager, at that point a female as well, advised this participant that this is the type of things that are normal. And you just have to bear it for just a little while once you find yourself, moving out of sight and into the office space. Another participant relayed how a chief resident engineer was addressing some male interns and stated, and as the participant PRNG11 said, that this person actually just said this to her face, as well, women belong in the kitchen. And then he hit me on, excuse me for my French, on my ass a few times because he felt that he could. Participants also revealed that taking maternity leave was seen as an unwarranted vacation. PRN stated, the one thing that really hurt me was the whole maternity leave thing. It's like almost frowned upon. It's like, why do you need 6 months? Like, why? Because they give you like 4 months, and then I took another 2 months of annual leave because I wanted to stay at home. And everyone was like, are you serious? You're taking another 2 months? And I was, do you know what a 4-month baby actually looks like? Participants described the environment as lonely and toxic. PRNG6 stated, so effectively, until you're professionally registered, which takes you about 5 years, they won't engage, they won't listen, they won't acknowledge. Excuse me. My apologies. PRNG6 and other participants also spoke about window dressing to have clients take them seriously. Because they did not see women as qualified to be engineers, they took male advice or recommendations. One participant even relayed how she was always silenced in the boardroom. So she went further to say, I'm in a boardroom and I'm saying the same things that my male counterparts are saying. But what tends to happen is when I voice my opinion, I'm sort of shut down. And what I would have said is turned away. And the very same thing that I've said, which a male colleague says, is accepted and is cheered on. So these are the kind of things that these participants have been through. PRNG also spoke about being mistaken for a tea lady on her first day. This was actually quite humorous when she spoke about it. She laughed about it, and said to me, on my first day, I was this, just a very tiny looking girl, walked into the boardroom and greeted by, all these male engineers sitting there. And they asked me, so where's the coffee and the tea? And she had to then introduce herself and say, well, actually, I'm not the tea lady. I'm actually the person that's joining today. And this is my name. And this is, basically where I come from, and this is my sort of where I was educated. And, she felt that she had to do all this explaining as to why she needed to be there. This comes back to the engineered identity construction an individual has underwent, that wired women to know their place and be subservient to the male counterpart, and for men to be raised as the dominant of the two sexes. And we see this play itself out in the workplace. For those men that have been wired in this way, it is unnatural and blasphemous that a woman is in a man's profession. Her place is in the home or in a profession that is more suited to her role as deemed by societal perceptions, that of a nurturer, like a teacher or a nurse. This results in the GBV, whether in the form of verbal harassment, sexual harassment, bullying, and victimization that women face. It is the many tactics employed to discourage and force women to exit the profession. In March this year, I conducted a webinar for the Water Operators Partnership between eThekwini Water and Sanitation and Hamburg, Wasser, Germany. And the topic was related to women in STEM and the challenges they face in a male-dominated profession. Women in this session related to the narratives of the participants of this research that was carried out in 2021, and also advised that initiatives are being put into place to try and eliminate the toxicity of the engineering space and bridge the gender gap. However, it was a far cry from being gender neutral and gender sensitized. Challenges still persist. Even at higher education, curriculum is technical and pedagogy not gender sensitized. This is also backed up by Singh 2023 when he states pedagogy must have a gendered lens to be sensitive enough to the needs and inequalities towards each gender. This is evidenced in one of the participants where they stated that by the end of the final year, we were 6 females in a class of 80. So you don't have the support. I think with females, we always need that support. On one hand, it was a struggle because we didn't grasp the concepts because it wasn't something we grew up with. Where the guys I've studied with, they grew up talking engineering and spoke a different jargon to what girls did. Girls grew up speaking dolls and play sets. Learning in the classroom should be on the technical aspects, but offer students who will graduate and move into professional environments soft skills in terms of group dynamics with regards to gender sensitization as a framework. According to the World Economic Forum Global Gender Gap Insight Report of June 2024, you can go to the next slide, Lawrence. Women make up half of the workforce based in non-STEM, and one of their main contributors that they speak about is about the cultural norms and the societal expectations that are often dictate the traditional roles, gender roles, and this notion to date is something that we see play itself out. So I've listed here, in terms of, as I spoke about curriculum and pedagogy, with STEM education, most of the participants that I spoke about, when I posed the question to them, we looked at the starting, in terms of identity. So where, when you started primary school, when you moved into secondary school, and then you moved into higher education, and what was it like for you? Because you came from a very, male-dominated space, and, you were able to actually then choose a qualification that was deemed to be male dominated, and most of these participants, we saw a cultural shift because most of these participants actually spoke about the father figure actually being the motivator that spoke to the daughter and sort of encouraged the daughter to say, this is something that I see that you can do, and don't let the stereotypes of gender sort of hold you back. But coming into the environment, into higher education, was also a difficulty. The participants said, when we came and we studied, yes, we got all this, theoretical knowledge, and but when we got onto the actual workspace, be it site or whether it was in a office itself, it was a whole different ball game. And university actually didn't prepare us for this. Yes, we knew all the technical aspects of it, but when it came to the group dynamics of it, as females, we felt very, like we were sort of excluded, and it was a space that the males didn't want us to be in. And that's where we saw sort of, this sort of notion about it being a gendered profession and, the old white boys club. So lots of women spoke about that. If you read the Athena report, it speaks a lot about that, the hard hat culture, the white boys club where women feel excluded. For example, if they're having a board meeting and, on a Friday, they all discuss, okay, let's go and play golf together. Women are sort of left out of this because it's, no, you need to go back home and go to the nursery. When I started this research as well, I was wondering what could I look at that was really a societal issue. And I think the light bulb moment came for me when I read at that point an article by the SAICI, the South African engineering. It's a president of one of these organizations, where he stated, the government is investing so much in women when it comes to STEM, but women at some point exit the profession and rather swap the boardroom for the nursery. And this is actually what motivated me to actually look at this topic, and specifically South African Indian women, because I know other women of ethnic backgrounds also come from cultures where it was, patriarchally driven. But when I looked at research, there wasn't actually any empirical evidence that spoke to this specific set of people. And this is why I focused on this. I've also, listed the Queen Bee syndrome. I think some of the things that the participants spoke about was, it was one thing going into the environment and, going through all this sort of victimization, this bullying, this harassing, from the male counterparts. But what was also seemingly interesting was that when these younger women went in as engineers, it was the older senior female engineers that sort of just brushed them off as well. And what they actually saw was, these senior female engineers felt that they had to fit into these old white boys club or the boys club and almost take on a man's role or persona in order to fit in, into the engineering space. So this was something that was also quite interesting. So in a media statement that was released by Ms. Refilwe Buthelezi, the president of the Engineering Council of South Africa in April this year, she stated that the time for lip service towards meaningful transformation is over. And she went further to say, we cannot keep having these conversations in isolation or with the male counterparts speaking at us rather than with us. We need more male champions to drive meaningful change in the sector. And according to the president of EXA, 8,002 female engineers were registered in the last 30 years of democracy. However, that being said, majority of the female engineers are still subjected to an environment of toxic masculinity and biasness that are embedded in the fabric of social institutions and workplaces, including but not limited to gender discrimination, sexual harassment, bullying, and work-life balance conflict. I wonder now if you can go to the next. Okay, I just put a nice little thing there where you can see the gentleman is honoring the other gentleman, Baba Watson, with a nice, lovely green blazer. And then when he goes over to the woman, he puts on a very nice green apron. So, I just wanted to sort of, use this as an indication or as a sort of a way of illustrating how women are seen, even though they have the same qualifications. Women spoke about, yes, I came from the same university, sat in the same class as this person, and the wage parity is still there. They've heard via HR or the little birdie that men are being paid more, even though they're at the same levels. So these are some of the challenges that these women are going through. And with regards to the gender-based violence part of it, which they are experiencing, this is the dialectic that I was speaking about. It's something that in their homes, two of my participants spoke about that, where they had to have their male partner always accompany them if they had to go onto site. And obviously this was not possible, and it was because of cultural or religious sort of dictatorship that it's actually cut them off of opportunities, and it put them in a very different sort of space in terms of giving them a competitive edge when it came to the male engineers who were not sort of whether it was even male engineers, Indian male engineers, because female South African Indian engineers came from homes that were within that patriarchal framework. There was always that difficulty, even if they came from a home where the father was a bit more liberal, but they walked into a work environment where unfortunately other males were sort of hardwired in that way, where it was, always sort of taught to them that a woman's place is in the kitchen and, a man's place is to basically put on a blazer and carry a briefcase and, bring the bacon home. Okay, Lawrence, you can go to the next slide. Thank you. I want to draw your attention to these stats. Okay. This is actually sad to see, but it was just a reinforcement of this engineered socialization and the hardwiring, that has them believing that it's okay, for a man to discipline his wife through brute force. So if you look at this is it's looking at sort of the Southern African countries, and it's looking at girls and women and boys and men aged between 15 and 49, and what they thought about whether husbands were justified to beat their wives under certain circumstances. And amazingly enough, you can see the girls and the women are showing at a much higher rate as compared to the men. And, it comes back to that. It comes back to what were you sort of, you born, you come into this world, you come with no identity, and you sort of wired, and this identity is built on you. It's like layers and layers, of socialization that's happening to make you the person that, your sort of cultural values and norms and, the value systems dictate that you should be, and how that actually affects people's thinking, in terms of, it's okay then, what, because my mom said to me that, or my grandmom said to me, or my dad said to me that, this is how it is, so it's normal. So very similar, if you're looking at this, what I'm showing you, the statistics, it goes back to when I was speaking about my participant who went to HR, and, the female HR person, they said to her, well, this is normal. What is normal about somebody sexualizing you in an engineering, site, making lewd comments, at you? And why is it that it's acceptable that, this is something that you will go through and that you will just have to deal with? And when we look at, 27 countries are currently sort of reporting on SDG 5. But in Southern Africa, out of the 14 countries, there's only 5 countries that's actually, tracking and, have a dedicated budget towards gender equality and women's empowerment. I've actually put in the PDF copy down there under the source. So if anybody is interested and they would like to look through this report, it is actually quite interesting. I would really encourage you to do so. We can move to the next slide, please. Okay, so I've spoken about that. And yes, the concerning statistics in South Africa. And we can see here that the police minister reported that South Africa has recorded 10,516 rapes. Okay, just look at those numbers. In the same period, 881 women were murdered. Okay, I mean, we're looking at South Africa. And this is just 2023 and 2024 statistics. If we're looking at a in a workspace itself, the recent rape that we had of the doctor in Kolkata, for example, an intern, 31 years of age, that was actually doing rounds, decided to take a rest, and then all these very sort of natural things happened to her, and it was raising sort of an awareness in this part of India, because there's so many of these crimes that are happening. So the point I'm trying to make is, yes, South Africa, we're looking at the concerning statistics, but globally there's also, there's a huge issue in terms of, women in these spaces and women having security and being able to be free in spaces. And in February 2024, when the SONA was delivered by the president of South Africa, he described GBV as the country's second pandemic. And I mean, that just says a lot. And he called to intensify collective efforts to bring an end to this. And in May this year, we saw our president sign the National Council of Gender-Based Violence and Femicide Bill, along with the National Prosecuting Authority Amendment Bill. And he said that GBV was a second pandemic in the country. It needed immediate attention from government. And in the third quarter of last year, close to 200 cases of GBV was recorded in the country, with over 1,500 cases of attempted murder involving women was investigated. Whether it will alleviate, at some point or completely eliminate GBV and bring about a more gender-considerate society is yet to be known. So that's me. You can go to the next slide, Lawrence. Thank you very much for listening. I'm sorry if I was speaking very fast. I was just hoping I'm not going to croak in between. But I do hope that you enjoyed my presentation. And if you do have any questions, I'm happy to take them, or you can put them into the chat and I will respond to them. Over to you, Lawrence. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Pillay. Really appreciate, your insights, on the SDG 5 gender equality, for providing us with stats. It was very detailed, very informative. And, if there's anybody else with a question, please type it in the chat box or raise your hand, and I will indicate to Dr. Pillay. Yeah. So in that case, I believe that her presentation was very detailed, very clear, and very informative. And I'd like to think that there is no question. So I believe we can proceed. If there is no question, anyone who has raised his hand, there is a hand up by Abdullah. So please, you can unmute yourself and speak. I have allowed mics for everybody. You may unmute yourself and speak. Yeah.
Yes, thank you, Lawrence.
Yes.
And thank you to Dr. Pillay, for that insightful presentation. And I'm particularly interested in the experiences of women, the Indian women who are in the STEM profession, especially the sexual harassment that they have endured in the workplaces. I would wish that you engage more with that, as well as the dynamics between the older generation versus the younger generation. I saw in one of your slides you said something of the Queen Bee syndrome, whereby the older generation might act as gatekeepers to the younger generation. It's just a comment and additional to what exists for Dr. Pillay.
Thank you, Nokuthula. I'm definitely noting that down. And yes, I'm actually looking currently. So I take your point on those two areas that, I can look further into when it comes to, as you said, the sexual harassment part of it, and also looking at the Queen Bee, where the gatekeeping happens. Currently, the article that I am presenting, which I'm sort of looking at now and I'm quite interested in, was looking at, curriculum and pedagogy. And I think what came out from the interviews from these respondents was that there wasn't actually that sort of preparation, and I think I mentioned that as well, that sort of soft skills that were given to, and it's not only the females. When I actually engaged with 2 universities to sort of reach out and ask, are you including stuff in your your curriculum that speaks about gender sensitization and basically the transition from your higher education space into the work environment? And EXA sort of is the accrediting body for the curriculum when it comes to engineering. And from when you look at the actual setup of what is required, as I said, it has a much more technical sort of touch to it, very rigid, more looking at what do we need an engineer to do. You come in there and this is what we want you to do. So there's no sort of I think importance given to the fact that there has been this historical thing of males have been dominating the space. Now we have women coming into the space, and my research was about how women, their experiences. But I think the other thing I thought about that what would have been interesting was to ask the men that were sort of receiving this woman in the space. And I spoke about the wiring and how were they actually sort of, trying to navigate themselves as well. That's maybe something interesting to also look at. And I think it comes back to where, I'm going to go right back down to primary school to say where gender roles are sort of, you play the doll and you play with the truck. No, we need to start encouraging. And then we have this thing, bring a girl child to work. At schools, we're sort of saying to the teachers as well, try to sort of encourage your girls to, where you see this, they have a sort of a affinity towards the science, technology, engineering, sort of, mathematics kind of thing. Try and encourage them, sort of adopt different methodologies that can actually, they don't know they're actually learning, because some people get sort of, it's that gendered sort of perceptions that's stuck in their wiring to tell them that I'm a girl and I can't do this. And they need to break down those walls, but they need to find effective ways of how they're doing it. And, always, not where we're saying, when we say gender sensitized and bridging the gap, it's not just for women. We're saying that, men are also hardwired this way. It's a generational thing. So when we're getting into the spaces of education, I think it becomes sort of a model obligation that we need to start breaking the cycle. And, that socialization can very much change there, where we open them up to, it's actually genderless. This is, what a girl can do, a boy can do, and what a boy can do, a girl can do. Guys can use pink and girls can use blue.
Just a quick one. Also to look at the policies that exist within these companies on how they are gender sensitive, and
Yes.
what is the perception? What is the perception from the male workers of these
Yes.
issues? Or
Absolutely.
policies?
Absolutely.
And
And I mean,
Lauren,
I spoke about just to talk about the policies quickly. I did speak about the maternity, and I think that was
Mhm.
something that was brought up by one of the participants. It was actually very, I'm going to say a very large and very well-known institute. And, she said that the policies, the way it was put together, it was so one size fits all. And it was not taking into consideration that, women, when they have babies and, there's certain things that are required. I mean, one mother spoke about, I had to come back to work and I was expressing milk in a bathroom and putting it into my boss's fridge, for an example. So she was very sort of disappointed that the company was just sort of rigid and said, this is how it is, and we're not flexible in that way. So yes, definitely,
yes,
we need to look at how these policies are also wired.
Yes, you can extend the policies and go to sexual harassment policies and harassment policies and so on. And some companies even have gender-based violence policies. So in order not to narrow your argument into maternity leave, because some women prefer not to have children. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you for that, Nokuthula. Appreciate all those comments.
Thank you so much again, Dr. Pillay. There is a hand raised, and there's also a few questions in the chat box. Zamogusha, you can go ahead. You can unmute and speak.
Thank you so much. This was really an insightful presentation. Thank you, Dr. Pillay. I'll start off with like a short comment and then go into my question. So the comment is regarding the policies, and I think this is a big thing that I'm an advocate of a movement towards degendering parenting, because I feel as though the terming of maternity leave and the discrepancies in the amount of time that maternity leave and paternity leave is perpetuates this narrative that women need to be the ones who take care of kids and men don't need to take care of kids. And I think that part of us moving away from that would be allowing the parents to decide, or maybe offering opportunity for both parents to be able to take that leave for childcare. Then going into my question, it's more around the concept of gender. I was wondering, I'm not sure if maybe I missed some of the parts, but I was wondering in your sample, the people that you spoke to, if they were only cisgender, or did you also include trans women's experiences in that? And I was wondering what the nuances was. And additional to that question would be around gender expression. Something interesting that I was just thinking as you're presenting is, since there is this concept of the old white boys club, and I was wondering how maybe if we're looking at it from a gender expression type of lens, in the sense of there are women who express, or their gender expression is more feminine, and there are women whose gender expressions are more masculine. So I was wondering if there were any differences in that, or any nuances around gender expression and the gender identity also.
Thank you for that very interesting question, actually. So I think I'm going to tackle the first one where you spoke about the participants in terms of sexuality or sexual orientation. So it's sort of, I definitely cannot say whether they were transgender women, but I can tell you there were some women that were single, not all were married. So I didn't actually ask in terms of sexual orientation. Okay. From where I was seated, it was mainly women. I assumed were, if they said unmarried or yet to be married, I didn't actually touch on whether, you're going to have a same-sex marriage or whether you're sort of heterosexual. I think what I wanted to know, or what my research was about, how their socialization, being in the home and being in a cultural environment that dictated what a woman's place should be and how they navigated that space and then sort of moved into the professional environment. What was very interesting, as I said, in this research, I actually thought that the participants, all 25 were going to give me the story of, it's always been where I'm sort of, told to do this and told to do that, and I must act like a girl. But it was strange that actually it was only 2 participants that spoke about coming from a home that was, really sort of embedded with that very strict sort of staccato cultural, norms and values. The other 25, I'd say 90% of them spoke about, the sort of the rise of the paternal motivator, which was actually, it swung the other way. It was something that I didn't expect to find. And I think with that, these women also spoke about, and when you're speaking about how they would express themselves. So if I was talking about, sitting and talking to these women and some of the things they were saying to me, I think they're almost, I'm going to say, desensitize themselves as well from being a woman or being a man. So for example, I had one of the participants say to me, well, every Sunday my dad and I used to go and we used to work on the engine. He had this kind of project and I used to work with him. And, my dad was very liberal. If my brother was going out clubbing, I would go to my brother. So it was not where we were restricted in any way. So, when it came to the work environment, when I asked her, how did you experience that? It wasn't actually a very difficult transition for her because it was the way she was sort of wired, I'm going to say it that way, or socialized in terms of her identity while in the home space, that she could express herself and not specifically having to be male because in this sort of deemed male profession, but it was just the way she expressed herself based on how she was sort of, those layers were sort of, created in terms of, I think in a positive way, not where she was so bound by, the patriarchy that sort of was the framework for, Indian women and how they would be, under normal circumstances, based on past experiences and ancestry, how they were raised. It was very different. I hope I'm making sense what I'm saying.
Yes, you answered my question. Thank you so much.
Okay, great.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Pillay. There is extra 2 questions
I see
in
one.
the chat box.
Yes,
Do you want to
Lawrence,
address? Yes.
Is it the one from Malonda? Which areas do you think need further study, especially regarding women in STEM, to improve their work environment? I think it kind of ties into this, what the other question is as well. Would companies be receptive? I think companies are employing certain, sort of, how do I say this? They are trying to look at initiatives to try and, or sensitize people about gender within the workspace. But I think I'm going to go back to what Zama was talking about and saying that, aren't we doing this then also when we do these things, we are sort of driving this, the stereotypes by saying or doing it in a certain way. I think for me, yes, companies can do that, when they're inducting, but I think not where they're raising it to make it, an issue or to sort of, make it a divide between genders. For me, I'm sort of very sort of strong on the point that, I still believe, or maybe it's an opinion of mine, that it should start from when, whether it's the girl child and the boy child, starting from, the education sphere, whether it's starting from primary and transitioning into secondary and then moving into tertiary, that's where the build-up needs to happen. And I think then when it comes to the classroom and how males and females sort of interact with each other, those sort of gender roles are not going to be there anymore because it's that space or that platform that's created within these educational environments that's going to break those stereotypes. Okay, so with companies, yes, they can roll that out, but I feel it's very late in the day when they're trying to do that. It's almost as though, the person's going in and has already been going through all of this, from being in school, being at a secondary level, primary, secondary, tertiary, and, you coming then to higher education, and then you kind of just go into the, you expect to just move into workspace and then boom, suddenly you're like, okay, well, nothing prepared me for this. So as much as I think companies can put stuff or put initiatives into place to maybe re-emphasize this and maybe try and, look at simulations or partnering women and men off and, giving each one sort of equal leadership roles, where they work with each other. But I think, the cementing of that foundation needs to start not at the company. It needs to start, right at the beginning. So, I mean, we've got one battle that's sort of won when I'm looking at specifically my research and, the male motivator that's coming out. So, that's good news. It means that, it was also about perceptions that people have about engineering. I mean, one engineer said to me, yes, my grandmother and my mother said to me, well, you're choosing a male's profession, you're a waste. So what are you going to be fitting light bulbs? Are you going to be fixing toilets? It was that they have this perception of what engineering, they actually don't know what it is. So I think where primary and secondary and tertiary comes in, but mainly primary and secondary, it also, schools can actually reach out even to parents where they see the child is showing an affinity to these subjects, whether male or female, but to sort of, get the parents on a different level as well, so that they have an understanding. Because remember, it's a vicious cycle. They've been socialized as well. They've been wired as well. So the wiring is continuing in certain homes. Unless we disconnect and we say, unlearn, relearn, and rewire, and, everybody's looking at it with one sort of lens, then we definitely going to win the battle. I hope I've answered your questions.
Yes. So thank you so much again, Dr. Pillay. I really appreciate you insights and tackling those questions. And I would like to rather move on to the next speaker, Dr. Zamambo Mkhize. So I will actually be reading out her bio before she starts her thingy presenting. So Dr. Zamambo Mkhize is a senior lecturer in the African Feminist Studies and the School of African and African Feminist Studies, Anthropology and Linguistics at the University of Cape Town. Dr. Zamambo got her undergraduate degree from Florida A&M University on a full tennis scholarship, where she graduated with a degree in criminal justice. She then got her honors in criminology and masters in gender studies from the University of KwaZulu-Natal. Dr. Mkhize did part of her PhD in Pennsylvania as a Fulbright scholar. Dr. Mkhize then did her postdoctoral fellowship at the Center of Critical Research on Race and Identity, where she focused on African women in the academy, as well as in the disciplines such as science, technology, engineering and mathematics STEM, and has written numerous articles around this topic, which has been published in high-impact international and local academic journals. Dr. Zamambo's research focuses has been on modern polygamy law, family, Zulu culture, and African feminism. She published her first book in 2021, titled Polygamy and Gender, published by the UKZN Press and now Routledge Press UK. She is currently researching transformation in higher education and STEM disciplines in South Africa, and founded the African STEMist Foundation, which is dedicated to supporting, mentoring, and advancing African women in STEM fields. In 2023, Dr. Zamambo was elected as a UCT Future Great and as an activist for academic and avid tennis player who, as a junior tennis player, represented her province, KwaZulu-Natal, in many inter-provincial tournaments that they always won, and represented South Africa in many international junior tennis tournaments. And Dr. Zamambo will be presenting based on gender and equality in higher education with a focus on STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. So without further ado, you may go ahead, Dr. Zamambo. Thank you.
Thank you, Lawrence. I'm going to share my screen. Please let me know if you can see my screen.
Yes, I can see your screen. You can also indicate with the thumbs up to the participants if you can see the screen.
Thank you, Lawrence, the Research Capacity Development Unit at the University of Johannesburg, for hosting this event, and organizers and many other people who worked very hard to make this panel discussion happen. And thank you, Dr. Pillay, for your kind words, and your presentation was very interesting. My talk will be focusing on gender inequality in higher education, specifically focusing on STEM, science, technology, engineering, mathematics. As the UN has declared, we are not on track to meet the 2030 agenda target because African children continue to live in abject poverty, face extreme privation of essential resources, and will never fully realize their full potential. Education is always perpetuated as a transformative, especially higher education, but then how can we break the cycles of entrenched discrimination and inequality? How can higher education fulfill its promise to unlock human potential? According to the stats, there are a little over 235 million students enrolled in universities globally. However, the enrollment rate in education remains a privilege, with vast disparities across regions. With this huge demand for higher education, education systems are dismally failing to meet the demand. Universities are key stakeholders to addressing many of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, with a specific focus on SDG 5, gender equality. Higher education institutions are drivers of progress by advancing research, fostering innovation, and dismantling and disseminating knowledge. The UN Summit of the Future, held in September this year, placed a renewed focus on the transformative role of higher education in tackling world global challenges such as inequality and sustainable development. World leaders, academics, and policymakers emphasize that universities must evolve to meet the demands of a rapidly changing world. The summit also underscored the importance of higher education institutions, not only in equipping students with skills for the future, but also contributing directly to the SDGs. In sub-Saharan Africa, the University of Cape Town leads the African Climate and Development Initiative, focusing on climate change research specific to the African continent. Through its work, the university has helped shape policies that address both environmental sustainability and economic resilience. So contributing to SDG 13, which is climate action, and SDG 8, decent work and economic growth. This initiative highlights how universities in the global south can play pivotal roles in shaping sustainable futures for their communities. My focus will be on STEM, which I'll pair with SDG 5, which is gender equality, and SDG 9, which is in industry, innovation, and infrastructure. Women continue to be left out pertaining to key leadership positions in government, in higher education, and socioeconomic industries. As you can see in the picture, 26.7% of all seats in parliament in the world are held by women, 35.5% in local governments, and 28.2% of management positions in the workplace. This shows that none of the 5 goals are met, or even almost met. So the gender gap in power and leadership remains entrenched. So this was taken from the United Nations Progress on SDGs, as a gender snapshot in 2023. And like I said, I'll be looking at SDG 9 as well. Women, according to gender equality, women continue to be restricted from achieving their full potential because of the gender division of labor. Women continue to do bulk of unpaid domestic labor, and they are solely responsible for the household chores and child rearing. Women and girls have made groundbreaking contributions in the field of STEM. Too many girls and women are held back by biases, social norms, and expectations, which influence the quality of education they receive and the subjects they study. They are particularly underrepresented in the STEM education. Women only make up 35% of STEM graduates, a figure which has remained unchanged in 10 years, and consequently affects STEM careers. This gender disparity is alarming, especially as STEM careers are often referred to as jobs of the future, which drive innovation, social well-being, inclusive growth, and sustainable development. Traditional gender roles continue to create a gap between males and females in STEM education and career paths. The gender gap stalls the overall growth of gender inequality, a defining factor for nations to achieve sustainable development. So to promote progression towards the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals and acknowledge the essential role women and girls have in STEM, the United Nations declared February 11 as International Day of Women and Girls in Science. UNESCO is committed to achieving gender equality in STEM through research, policies, and capacity building work, and as part of its efforts to promote the empowerment of girls and women through education. There are many programs and projects across African countries such as Ethiopia, Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, Rwanda, Nigeria, and South Africa, which encourage and assist girls in STEM fields. By providing them with scholarships or creating social clubs, equipping schools with right technological and tools, or ensuring teachers have the necessary resources to teach STEM subjects. These methods reinforce goals in STEM and help grow the number of African women and girls in STEM professions. As you can see in the picture in the screen, the ongoing gender barriers limit women's role in science, technology, and innovation. Patterns already are evident as AI takes off. In science, technology, and innovation are radically transforming how people live, socialize, and pay their bills, order food, study, and work. These advances have increased human connectivity, but also raised concerns about individual security, rights, and freedoms. Women in particular face heightened risk of technology facilitated violence. Further, while some countries are at the forefront of machine learning, big data, and artificial intelligence, others grapple with insufficient digital infrastructure and broadband connectivity. An over-expanding technology and information divide will push groups that are already disadvantaged even further behind, including women and girls in rural, poor households and from marginalized communities. The latest global data confirmed ongoing challenges preventing women from equally engaging in dynamic and innovative economic sectors. Women are 2 times less likely than men to know a computer programming language based on data from 62 countries and areas with data from 2017 and later. In 2022, inventors listed on international patent applications were 5 times less likely to be female than men. In 2020, women held only 1 in 3 research positions worldwide and only 1 in 5 science, technology, engineering, math jobs, STEM jobs. Their absence in the emerging AI industry has already had an adverse impact on how well this technology supports women and responds to their needs. Facial and voice recognition systems, for example, predominantly designed by men, are more adept at recognizing male voices and lighter-skinned male faces. So darker-skinned females are the most misclassified group. So challenging social biases, increasing women's education, and expanding women's participation in STEM are all vital to transforming information and technology so that it works for gender equality. In support of the transformational change, the 66th session on the Commission on Status of Women in 2020 has called for targeted measures to address the growing digital divide, including policies that promote universal digital learning and literacy policies that support women's equal participation in senior management positions. According to stats by the UN, globally, Africa has the highest proportion of women STEM graduates. 47% are women graduates in African universities. However, despite this theoretically exciting statistics, African women remain grossly underrepresented in STEM fields. And as to why, I'll talk about it later. The African Gender Index relating to STEM education was only 37.9% for the 20 African countries where it was measured, indicating a significant imbalance in favor of men undertaking education in this field, and consequently STEM careers. While girls are just as capable as boys of excelling in STEM, cultural expectations in households, schools, colleges, and workplaces, along with environmental circumstances and levels of support, discourage girls from studying these subjects. In 107 out of 114 countries, women are underrepresented among STEM graduates, with less than 4 women out of 10 men. Worldwide, women represent only 35% of students studying STEM fields in higher education. It is in poorer countries where such talent is most needed, and yet where women are most underrepresented. Worldwide, less than 30% represent the number of women as scientific researchers. This is also the case in high-tech domains such as artificial intelligence. Women represent 29% of the workforce in the AI sector in the African continent, and only 10% of executive positions are taken by women. However, according to the latest report compiled by the Times Higher Education and the United Nations Scientific, Cultural, and Educational Organization, UNESCO, 47% of African universities in STEM are STEM graduates. Undergrads and postgrad levels are women. This means Africa now has the highest proportion of female STEM graduates, though women are still underrepresented in the ICT sector. The gender gap in STEM is also missed opportunities for economies and an efficient allocation of talent and labor. The percentage of females graduating from tertiary education, engineering fields was below 30% of many sub-Saharan African countries, among them South Africa. Consequently, scientific work and technological innovation are missing women's perspectives and critical contributions. This also means that most women will remain in jobs that are likely to be replaced by AI or technology on lower pay grades or less economically impactful in an increasingly technological-driven world. Female participation in the labor market in STEM fields also trails behind that of men. Only 7% of all engineers in South Africa today are women, and even smaller percentage is African women. However, education in STEM begins from an early age, and there needs to be a concerted, conscious effort to eradicate stereotypes such as only boys are good at science, engineering, mathematics, especially in school. Women in STEM in South Africa. South Africa remains one of the most unequal societies in the world. Although in 1994 we became a democracy, we were sold an illusion of a rainbow nation, and that in the age of democracy, things will magically erase centuries of systemic and structural racism. African students were led to believe that they will not only have access to quality education, but they will be welcomed, accepted, and succeed in these spaces previously denied to them. Now everyone had access to higher education, but the legacies of apartheid remained firmly intact. Structural and systems remain white, had moved from overt racism to a covert racism, and liberal policies such as neoliberalism, which further excluded African students by the imposition of meritocracy. The percentage of graduates from tertiary STEM programs in 2020 was 17.4%, though in 2022, only 13% of STEM graduates were women in South Africa. 50.3% of girls compared to 58.6% of boys, achieved 30% or higher in the mathematics and the National Certificate examination. So despite the low numbers of women in tertiary STEM education in South Africa, efforts are being made to change this disparity. For example, there's a Tengwane program, which creates opportunities for STEM for selected secondary school girls. The girls receive mentoring, make contacts with different organizations by attending the Tengwane's annual STEM Expo event. They also promote STEM in their own communities. The Gender Parity Index indicates that the ratio of male to female enrollment or education with an indicator of one describing balance between males and females. In South Africa, there is general parity in the gross enrollment ratio, which slightly favors women, while the school life expectancies for women seems to be more favorable. The student movements of hashtag Rose Must Fall and hashtag Fees Must Fall highlight that there is substantial work that needs to be done to undo the legacies of apartheid in South African higher education. African students continue to face substantial challenges such as socioeconomic biases, racism, sexism, socioeconomic challenges, interpersonal factors, hostile environments, which is linked to the foundation of the ideology of STEM, which is predicated on scientifically proving the racial superiority of whites to Africans. The attrition rate, 30% students face attrition in their first years, 20% in second and third year, and 33% if they are first generation students in universities. Why are African women underrepresented in STEM? When you look at these statistics, this was a racial breakdown of the STEM stats across South African universities in a 21-year period. So I'll give you an example. Let's say in science, for postgraduate, there are 80 honors that take 80 students that take honors. 17 of those students might move on to masters, and then 5 might move on to their doctorates. And within that 5, 3 would be foreign national students, 2 will be South African, and out of the 2, 1 South African student, if they are lucky. So this across all races, and unsurprisingly, the white people have consistently and steadily improved their numbers over 2 decades. Okay, someone's mic is on. Okay. So why? What? I don't know, Lawrence. Can you see who that is, and can you ask them to please switch off the mic?
Yes, I disabled. Okay. Apologies. Apologies.
Okay. So why do African women remain extremely underrepresented in STEM? Well, it's because of the racial and gendered norms and stereotypes. Another one is African generational tax, where African students are going to universities, get a degree, and if they take any of the STEM degrees and they want to continue to postgraduate, they are discouraged from doing so from their parents, who tell them, you have a degree, you have to go out and work and come back and help support the family. So even if they want to continue, they can't continue. Some do come back later on in life and continue with their postgraduate studies. Discriminatory practices, which is systemic and structural barriers. Bullying and harassment, which they face, which is even perpetrated from people who want to opt in and out of Blackness, who are categorized as Black in South Africa, being Indian and colored, but they also perpetuate racism onto African students, and the lack of role models and mentors. So how can we combat underrepresentation? Well, we can start by dismantling gender biases in education, especially in primary and secondary schooling, in learning materials. Parents and teachers need to work together to reprogram the social and psychological belief that boys are better in mathematics and science, make focused, conscious efforts to encourage girls and nurture them in these STEM subjects. They need to address institutional cultures and hostile STEM environments and dismantle racialized gendered stereotypes. Find solutions to eliminate structural, environmental, and systematic barriers. For example, a student taking science, usually science students have to be in the labs some all night or over the weekend. And it's a problem for students who are using public transport because public transport ends at a particular time. So they're not able to stay in the lab as other students who can. So for example, the science lab could provide transport for these science students who rely on public transport to be able to stay in the lab and be able to be on trend with other races and not fall behind in their work. They can promote and allow Indigenous knowledge to be cultivated and legitimatized in the STEM labs in order to allow students to find African solutions to African problems. They can have sensitivity and unconscious bias training for all professors supervising students in order to check their racism and sexism. They can have mentorships, networking, and skill development. And they can have redress. Transformation is not just about replacing white faces with black faces. They need to stop on relying on identity politics to push transformation forward. True and sincere transformation is inclusive of all races and genders to work together and united to progress the transformation agenda. They can retain women in STEM industry by removing barriers that obstruct their success, such as funding women in STEM startups, having flexible working hours, paid family leave, childcare support. So access among Black students can only be achieved through their meaningful integration, participation in academic and social activities that can enhance their success while at university. Despite the burgeoning numbers of Black students across different government universities, I argue that access without provision for sustainability and continuity is not an opportunity. The implications of offering access to disadvantaged students does not end, but rather begins at the point of entry. Given that the diversity and inequalities created by history and the increased demand for change, it has become so complex to deal with the factors that contribute towards student attrition in South African higher education. With the diverse nature of student learning needs, it has become imperative for institutions, educators, researchers, and policymakers to develop more critical and nuanced approaches to address the issue of high attrition amongst Black students. Besides the racism and sexism cliche that has been predominantly problematized as a key challenge towards the achievement of meaningful transformation, there are other reasons why Black students drop out of university, such as institutional culture, lack of integration, sense of identity and belonging, racism, sexism, finances, lack of mentoring, lack of grit and resilience, and needing to actually nurture that. The ineffective management of diversity, reinforced by racism and sexism in institutional cultures, have continued to threaten the character of transformation and social cohesion across South African university. In reality, the white minorities are centuries ahead of the African majority. Equality is not enough. Equity is needed to level the playing field, and liberation is that in an ideal world, there'd be no war at all, as the picture shows, because everyone would be able to see and enjoy the game with an unobstructed view. South African universities have to solve its deeply ingrained discrimination based on race and gender if it wants to transform STEM discipline and contribute positively to the SDG 5 and close the gap of women in STEM. According to the Times Higher Education's impact rate rankings, universities play a central role in advancing SDGs through research, stewardship, outreach, and teaching. The 2024 rankings show how institutions worldwide are aligning their missions with SDG initiatives, underscoring the importance of higher education in achieving global objectives. This growing recognition reinforces the notions that universities are not just educational institutions, but engineers for sustainable development and the social equity. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Kize, for the very, very, very insightful presentation. It's really important, to speak about, these issues, on gender equality, and I believe it's very vital, in shaping the future for all the future generations as well. And I just wanted to ask if there is any further questions from anybody. If you can also raise your hand, and you can also type in the chat box. I see there's a hand up. There was a hand previously up by Marvin. I don't know if you wanted to say something. So I'll just enable everybody's mics. Then you may unmute on your side and speak. So there's a hand raised rather by Nuktula. You may go ahead and ask your question.
Thank you, Lawrence. Thank you, Dr. Mkhize, for that whole roundabout, very insightful presentation. And Mr. Lawrence, it's
Yes,
actually Professor Mazibuko speaking.
Oh, apologies for that. Apologies.
It's okay. I appreciate the last speaker when they were giving us what the problems are, as well as what the solutions are. We tend to be tasked as universities to analyze some of these scenarios, and whereby we look at government departments like your DSI, Department of Science and Technology, or it used to be technology, then it became science and innovation, and so on, as well as research institutions. Why there isn't the number of women? Why is it not increasing? And we always look at the top player, whereas Dr. Mkhize now was just taking us to the deep layers that have prevented why the space of women in the STEM is so small. Even when the government, the research institutions and post institutions, post-school, business industry, civil society, they come with all these plans and all these resources, but we seem to have under layers. Dr. Mkhize mentioned in the mouthful, so many of them. I couldn't, by the like of me, even come up with a question other than to say that was quite impressive how she analyzed all of that, or all the issues that seems to be we're battling with when we have to understand what seems to be the issues. So I'm just saying that I quite enjoy this session, especially when she was talking about the systematic barriers that seems to appear within our environment, and the perceptions, the stereotypes, the racism, the gender inequalities, and so on. So I'd just like to say well done to you in this presentation. And sure, for the likes of me, I honestly, I'm dumbfounded by what we just heard right now. So thank you, Mr. Lawrence, for that. It's just to say thank you to Dr. Mkhize.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Prof. Mazibuko. I appreciate that. It is a lot, yes. So thank you.
It is a lot, and it is needed. Yeah. It is a lot, and it needs to be read. It is a lot, and it can influence policies. It is a lot, and it can influence how we view this part of profession than for us to rely on our foreign counterparts. So it is a lot that we do need to hear, and it's quite impactful. So thank you for that.
Thank you so much again, Prof. Mazibuko. That is very insightful. Thank you for mentioning that. Very, very important. We have a question here, Dr. Mkhize. There is a question for you in the chat box. It says, hi, Dr. Zamambo, your wealth of knowledge is very practical. Are you in any way looking for or structuring a practical approach with social services at the education system to impact society from a community level and from a primary school level?
Thank you so much for that question. Yes, I just saw it now in the chat. No, I am not I'm not working with secondary and primary school. I'm only looking at higher education for now. Hopefully in the future, I'll be able to work with them.
Okay, perfect. There is another question as well, probably another comment as well. Thank you so much, Dr. Mkhize, for this rounded layout of problems in STEM. From an African and feminist perspective, you have also highlighted the problem from a life course model, which is refreshing to see, as this problem is not only gendered, but social, cultural, and developmental.
I see that question, yes.
Yeah, I think it was probably, rather like a comment.
Thank you so much. Yes, thank you for that comment, Dr. Diti. Thank you.
Okay. There is another question as well. I say, Dr. Mkhize, I'm a third year IT student, and you making me worried here. I read the stats. My question is, how can you encourage more young women to take up courses like programming and software engineering?
See, that's a very good question, because I found in my research that women who are actually taking IT in higher education, postgraduate studies are struggling. The women that I interviewed, there were only 2 in the doctorate year, and it's difficult because of the stereotypes. And and what was so interesting, it wasn't just the professors and the lecturers who teach them that have these stereotypes when they have programs or projects. They only want the male students to be on these projects. It's also the students themselves amongst themselves, which I found was very worrying, in that you would think students are a younger generation, they're more progressive in their thinking, right? And they are the ones, the male students, who would heckle the woman, who would say, why are you doing a PhD in this? Who's going to marry you? Why are you doing this? You're going to be overqualified. And my question is always the same when someone says you're overqualified, as you overqualified in work or overqualified in life, as to who you're going to partner with. What is this overqualification you're so worried about? But yeah, so I think it's still about dismantling stereotypes, and also the psychological stereotypes that people believe certain genders or races are better in particular subjects. And then when you enter them, you become a rebel in a way, and you're dismantling this normalized expectations of what does an engineer look like, who is a mathematician. So I think you need to be strong in order to be able to create change. Yeah. So just good luck, Yolanda. All the best.
Thank you so much again for that, Dr. Mkhize. There is rather a question as well. It says, thank you so much, Dr. Mkhize, for a rich theoretical discussion and pragmatic solutions. Your contribution in STEM is important. I think that's also rather a comment. And there is another one which goes, good presentation, giving a thorough and insightful overview of challenges facing African women in STEM. It is disheartening to hear what they face, but reassuring that research such as yours is bringing the problematic dynamics to light.
Thank you,
And yes,
Dr. Nyasha, for that.
I just read the last question. It says, thank you, Dr. Mkhize, for your presentation. You spoke about institutional barriers to African women entry into STEM fields. Could you please expand a bit on issues of epistemological barriers to African women's entry, particularly with respect to IKS?
Thank you so much for that question, Vanessa. And I think I should tell everyone that Vanessa is our fearless leader in the African Gender Institute, our director. So it is unfair that she's asking this question, because it's Indigenous Knowledge System, IKS, that's what you mean about. So what are the barriers? And I think one of the biggest barriers is that African knowledge is not seen as credible. And even if you want to bring it into a science lab, there are a lot of barriers you would face, because it's sort of how it hasn't been scientifically proven in the Western way of proving, I guess, certain things. So it's a lot they have to overcome, and as to what is credible knowledge and who determines what is credible knowledge. Why can't knowledge that was passed down to me by my grandmother about a particular plant that helps in terms of alleviate stomach issue, for example, why can't that be seen as a legitimate scientific knowledge? Because it was orally passed down, or is it because it's African knowledge and there's no way to trace it? I don't know, but that is a difficult question to answer, and it's a difficult thing to bring into these STEM fields, indigenous African knowledge system. So thank you for that question.
Okay, thank you so much again, Dr. Mkhize. Very insightful presentation. Thank you so much. Really appreciate you here at the RCD unit. Thank you so much. Is there any further question? If any comments, probably. You can raise your hand if you have any question before we move into our final speaker of the day. Yes, I see a hand up.
Hi there.
Yes.
Hi. I would just like for Uzama to please share one thing that she would like us to all take away from her talk today. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Dr. Titi. So one thing I'd like people to take away from this is, as Professor Mazibuko had mentioned earlier, is that we are faced with issues, but unless there is research done as to why 30 years into democracy are still African students so grossly underrepresented in PhDs, graduating PhDs, there has to be something going on deeper than what we are being shown by stats. Stats tell a story, absolutely, but until you go deeper underneath and find out as to what is the actual story, then we can go in and actually find ways where we can rectify the situation. And I made that example of the science lab and what the institution can do to help Black students stay in the science lab until later in the hours. Simple things like that. But I don't know, maybe it's difficult, I don't know. But that's what I want you to take away, that when you see stats, you see these things, question as to what is the underlying story happening. So thank you.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much, Dr. Titi. Thank you so much, Dr. Zamambo, for tackling the question. Thank you so much. Rather, there's no any question in the chat box, and there's no hand raise, and that is fine. We can proceed to the next speaker today, Prof. Elena. Are there any further comments from you, Dr. Zamambo, or we can proceed?
Please proceed. Thank you to everyone in the questions.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you so much again. So our next speaker is Prof. Elena. So Prof. Elena will be speaking more on gender equality and care of older persons in Southern Africa. So before she proceeds, I'd like to go over her bio, rather. So Prof. Elena Moore is a professor of sociology in the Department of Sociology at the University of Cape Town, with a focus on family caregiving of older persons in Southern Africa. She was awarded the Wellcome Career Award in 2023 and 2028 to develop a pioneering research program, which includes the first multi-sited qualitative longitudinal study on family caregiving in Africa. In addition to her research, she leads an extensive policy engagement initiative recently recognized with the IDR Scaling Care Innovations in Africa Award for the project, Transforming Elder Care Through Collective Policy Action in Southern Africa. She is a recipient of the Distinguished Teaching Award in 2021 and the Vice Chancellor Social Responsiveness Award in 2023 from the University of Cape Town. So without any further ado, you may proceed, Prof. Elena, and thank you so much.
Thanks, Lawrence. Can everybody see the slides and hear me?
Yes, I can see the slide. Can everybody just indicate with a thumbs up if you can see Prof's slides?
Thanks very much. And thanks, Lawrence and the RCD team for, again, organizing this great seminar. I appreciate the invite, and thanks to the previous speakers. Zama, we can chat later, but thanks for those wonderful talks and presentations. So I'm Elena, and I'm this PI on this Family Caregiving of Older Persons program in Southern Africa. Hold on, let me just see. And basically, you know, I've been doing work in the area of like the sociology of family for probably 20 years in different parts of not just the world, but of South Africa and Southern Africa. And at some point, you know, it dawned on me that our understanding and the sociological understanding of family caregiving of older persons was not well understood, at least theoretically or in the literature. And this is at a time when the aging population in the region is rapidly increasing. So, for example, there's been a 75% increase in South Africa over the last 2 decades of older persons. There's 6 million older persons currently in 2024, and it represents about 9.3% of our population. Now we see all the predictions, that's going to double in the next 25 years. So that by 2050, 1 in 5 people will be classified as an older person. And we can debate at length what exactly, you know, this definition of older person means, and we can do that in the discussion. But according to the Older Persons Act, you know, people over 60 are classified as older persons, and as a result, they, you know, there's particular care needs that they may develop in time or at the time when they are classified as an older person. Now, the care need currently is increasing, given the increase in NCDs that's been happening over the last 2 or 3 decades, and it's shaping the nature of illnesses and conditions, especially in countries with high levels of hypertension and diabetes. And a lot of the attention goes to the health, you know, the health system and the ways in which the health needs of the older person is managed, not necessarily managed, but kind of serviced by, let's say, the health sector. And less attention is given to the family care done at home. We know that conditions are managed at home, they're not managed in hospitals. So increasing levels of not only NCDs, but also of communicable diseases such as TB and HIV, it really complicates the care work that's taking place in homes. And that leads us to question, well, who's caring? And we know that there's quite a poor long-term care infrastructure in the country, in the region. Family care dominates. Family care is the long-term care infrastructure. It dominates as the main form of support. But there, as I said earlier, there's little understanding of how it happens and what are the gendered inequalities divisions, the racial divisions, and class divisions of how this all occurs. So we need to understand care of older persons and the gender and racial dynamics better. I mean, until we can kind of better define the problem or the issues and the challenges, it's until that time that we can try to think through the various policy options, support structures, and services that exist. Currently, a lot of the countries are just jumping on the bandwagon and taking concepts that are largely developed in the north, such as healthy aging, aging in place, without really thinking through how these concepts are perhaps ill-equipped or need to be, you know, changed to deal with realities and contexts of care in the region. So there's assumptions being made that the family will and can care, and this is deeply problematic and allows the state to push care back to the household, which they've been doing for many, is not a new phenomenon, but they've been doing for many decades. There is also a question around political will. In Southern Africa, care for older persons has, needless to say, been competing against many other pressing policy issues, whether that's, you know, youth issues, employment issues, the list is long. And we will currently face many climate, you know, issues and crises in the coming years, if we haven't already. So as a result, the elder care sector has been hugely neglected, and it's one of the least transformed sectors in our society. So just to say quickly who we are. So the program is made up of 3 components, as you can see in the circle here, and we work across areas of thinking around the care economy, aging, social protection, and family relationships. And what we're trying to do really is to create spaces for discussions, conversations, and dialogue across a range of stakeholders, government officials, NPOs, care workers, older persons, family caregivers, researchers, etc. And when we have those conversations, we can see kind of where the priorities are. What do we know? What do we not know? Who are we listening to and who are we excluding in these conversations? And with that, improving this kind of level of conversation and awareness of elderly care as an issue allows us to kind of co-construct, we hope, better evidence, but also better policies that will be African-centered and ultimately impact and improve the well-being of both older persons, but also carers for older persons. So we're working across 19 sites across 4 countries. So we're working in South Africa, Namibia, Botswana, and Malawi. And within South Africa, I'll just say we're working across 3 provinces in Western Cape, Eastern Cape, and KwaZulu-Natal. And in South Africa, we're in 7 sites. We're obviously working across 10 different languages across the region with a team of about 40 researchers. And we're working with ultimately 340 families over time. So we've just undertaken the last 2 years of working with the families, 4 or 5 times a year over the 2 years to see how they're doing, to see how their care needs are being attended to, what the challenges are, etc., etc. And we're doing it through multiple methods, through everything from obviously in-depth interviews to monthly budget checks, and vignettes, and the list, the list is long. What we're trying to emphasize and think through is the place of care and how that place of care shapes the experience of care. Today, obviously, the talk is focused on the SDGs and gender equality. And the idea of the SDGs is the idea of leaving no one behind, and care of older persons and attention to caregivers of older persons, needless to say, is a crucial aspect. So this talk focuses on families, it focuses on households, care dyads, kinship relations, to understand the enduring racialized, gendered and class inequalities, the gendered poverty that exists in older person households. We do that by looking at where are older persons, who are they living with, what access to what resources do they have, what are the forms of relationships and kind of supports that exist. Needless to say, we haven't got all the findings just yet, but I will present some of them to you today. So as I said, in our work, we focus on families, households, in understanding older persons' care and their care needs. And we see how living and elderly care arrangements really do tell us something about a mix of SDGs, so not just gender equality or inequality, but also poverty eradication, the promotion of healthy lives and well-being, as well as one of the most important things currently is food insecurity and this SDG of zero hunger. So in the talk, I will present evidence drawn from both the Family Caregiving Programme, which looks at our own qualitative work with families, but also at a range of analysis we've done on, national income and expenditure surveys. And I will focus specifically on South Africa. I wasn't actually sure if I was meant to, but that's what I've done for today. And I think what's important as well is how our team really don't want to isolate thinking around gender inequality away from other forms of either intersectional understandings of social divisions. That not only so not focusing on one SDG, but actually the intersection of these SDGs and their coexistence. So just to give you a snapshot of if we were to think about gender inequalities, racial inequalities, class inequalities amongst older persons, who are older persons? Needless to say, that's a heterogeneous group. And in order to get a better sense of older persons, and particularly, I'm going to speak most specifically around older person grant beneficiaries. I'll refer to them as older persons. I won't keep saying older person grant beneficiaries, but we know that older person grant beneficiaries who receive a state pension, it is means tested, and they have access to less income, and therefore most of our work works with older person grant beneficiaries. So we examine through statistics and other methods, who are they, what sorts of health conditions might they have, and what are potential care needs, and how are these care needs met or unmet. So we see that, similar to the broader population, 80% of older persons and I keep saying older person grant beneficiaries, they are Black. But where we see differences is we see where they're living. So, for example, 59% of older persons are living in rural areas, whether that's a traditional rural area or it's a farm area. And that has very important consequences for access to care, access to resources. We think about water, we think about roads and other services. But we also think about the work that will involve for a caregiver who is attending to someone and helping someone who needs to get to a clinic, for example. So not only is it, are older persons more likely to be found in a rural area, and that number radically differs across the region, I should say, with Namibia and Malawi having much higher levels of older persons living in rural areas. But we also see from this diagram or this infographic that 1 in 3 older persons live in KZN. Now that number is actually going up, and these figures are from 2022. That number is currently, the number of older person grant beneficiaries is highest in KZN than anywhere else in the country. So if 1 in 3 older persons live in KZN, clearly KZN is a crucial place to be understanding the care needs, the care the care challenges of older persons. Not only that, but we see in the bottom corner of this chart here that more than twice as many older persons, let's say, are women, so rather than men. 3 times as many are widows rather than widowers. And there's different reasons for this, but one of the main reasons is that because women live longer than men. But they don't just live longer, women live in poorer health for longer, and also women require care for longer. But we all know that more women are going to give care. And so this phenomena, which is similar across the world, but not as explicit, I suppose, as here, is called the feminization of elderly care, where the increased number of older persons are women, but they're also being cared for by women. And I'll go into this a little bit more detail. And I suppose here our connections to the SDGs and the explicit questions around gender equality have become quite stark. Now, I think we could analyze every single health condition of older persons. It wouldn't tell us much. It would tell us about health conditions. It doesn't tell us about care needs. And I think in the literature, in policy, a lot of the, I won't say confusion, a lot of the errors in thinking and conceptual thinking is conflating health needs with care needs. The two things are very different, as we all know. So for example, yesterday was International Day of Care and Support. I'm sure many of you are aware. And you'll see in South Africa here that the number of older persons having difficulty walking is 25%. So that's over 1 million people, right? But that only tells us about the physical difficultiness, let's call it, if that's a word, of walking. It doesn't tell us about what they need. Is it that they need better streets, better paths? Is it they need a handrail? Is it they need more people to assist? Do they need a wheelchair? Do they need a toilet that's indoors? All of these health needs or difficulties with everyday activities tell us something, but it still doesn't, until we start to unpack the environment in which older persons are living and the disabling environments in which older persons are living, will we get to grips with what care needs actually look like. And obviously to do that, we need to hear from older persons themselves. So this is a really important conceptual point, and I think where it differs from a lot of work that's previously been done in the area of, a lot of work has been done on the health needs or the health conditions of older persons, but not so much the care needs. One other issue and kind of grand narrative that floats around quite a lot is the idea that actually pensions are enough. Well, I'm not saying that, no one believes that, but in a context such as South Africa, but not only, it's in Southern Africa, there is a belief, or at least a kind of a commentary, that attending to the cash needs, if you want to call it that, or the economic needs of older persons is attending to the care needs. Now, we all know, again, that there's a range of reasons why that is problematic. So, I'm not going to give you an entire landscape of the long-term care infrastructure, but one of the main forms of support for older persons is the state pension. And there is limited formal care, such as home-based care or senior centres. Most specifically, this is highly uneven across the country. So in former homelands and provinces that were former homelands, this is really far, like very scant compared to other provinces or other urban areas. So it means that the pension, as the main source of state support, is expected to cover the needs of the older person. But we know that and we can see from this chart that actually, if that was the case, we still have very, very high levels of old age income poverty. Now, I know there's complications with measuring poverty in particular ways, but we know that the old age pension is, beyond the poverty line, and it's technically, and I say technically in inverted, you can't see my hands, but inverted commas, it would be sufficient supposedly to meet the needs, at least the basic needs of an older person if they were alone. And so the question is that we know that while 6 million people are older persons and there's almost 4 million grant recipients, why then is there such still an ongoing high level of income poverty? And the reasons are multiple. I'm going to give you a few examples and draw upon our qualitative work in different parts of the country. And the first example I'll give you, and this is now thinking about gendered work and gendered and racialized work that takes place in obviously in families, in particular parts of the country and particular provinces. So here is a short overview of a particular Black South African family in rural KZN with 13 people living in the household. There's 4 adults and there's 9 children. The total household income is, as you can see there, is 5,580. The pension here is used to cover the household food needs. The child support grants barely cover school transport fees and lunchbox costs. The one daughter is the primary carer, is constantly working and caring, but only gets irregular paid work in the form of piece jobs and washing clothes. The other 2 daughters lost jobs during COVID, but are also needed to support the 24-hour care needs of the older person and the children that are in the household. No one considers the work of the caregiver as work, and only the pension is considered quote unquote valuable and a contribution. And this gets depicted in the kind of speech bubbles that are here. The caregiver, and you can see the reason she's there 3 times is because she's obviously doing these 3 activities and work activities at the same time. So on the one hand, she says, I think mainly I need a job, and by having a job, I will be able to do the thing that would make my mother happy and comfortable. The older person says, the mother, the grandmother in this case, we are constantly struggling. This is made worse by the fact that my daughters do not work. This really strains me so much. At the same time, the caregiver talks about how she washes sometimes at people's homes, like for other older persons who are not strong enough to take stuff to the river. And she might get 60 Rand or 70 Rand a week for doing this, whether it's blankets or linen. So here we see the gendered work. There's paid work, unpaid work, but the extent of the activities is very large. If we move to a place in Cape Town in Eerste River, for those of you who may know it, and we look at another household, here we have a 3-generation female household in the sense of there's a grandmother, a mother, and a daughter, an adult daughter. And this household consists of the social grant. You can see that there. At the time, it was 2008. I know it's more now. And limited cash contribution from some child minding that the middle generation mother does. And she gets 1,000 Rand for that. And her adult daughter, who's in her early 20s, gives over 1,000 as a household contribution in paying her way and being there and helping the household. The female caregiver was deeply distressed about the lack of money for basics such as electricity. She explained there had been no money for electricity for months. They buy daily as a way of trying to manage, as they can't afford to get their fridge fixed. She looks after her baby for 1,000 Rand a month whilst minding her mother who has dementia. And when I say she has very high care needs and needs to be watched all the time. So when we returned, and a couple of months later, and I was speaking to Gwen is the pseudonym for this particular lady. I spoke to Gwen, and she was now minding, 6 months later, 3 children, 2 newborns, a child who was about 2, and her mother at the same time. The granddaughter works as a cleaner in a private company, but has low pay and high transport costs. While she gives her mother 1,000 Rand, she often also has to help out. And here we see the impact of the care need in the household, who's providing it, how it impacts on their future lives or their current life and their future lives. That doesn't say that they don't want to do it, needless to say, but it does show how resources are constrained in the household currently, but also will impact on the future work activities of both the middle generation and the younger generation. We go to the third example is a household in Eastern Cape. The caregiver here does all household chores such as preparing meals, cleaning, tidying, laundry. She also runs a tuck shop for her grandmother. And she kept on saying for the grandmother. Now the grandmother in the recent months has become less capable of working in the shop, and she no longer works in the house and is largely bedbound over the last 6 months that we were with her. So the caregiver does the shopping for the household items. She also does all the shopping for the tuck shop. She accompanies the older person to the doctor and clinic visits and any other visits she may need to make, such as to ShopRite or to the bank, for example. And she helps her, it's actually her grandmother, move around within the house when needed. The caregiver also cares for her son during this time. He's not yet at school-going age, and he's not yet at ECD. Now, the care receiver here, the older person, and apologies for those crude concepts, but the older person here has 3 children. She has one daughter who has passed away, another daughter who is married, and the older person says that she does not expect anything from that daughter who is married. She has her own household. The older person also has a son, and the son contributes 800 Rand per month. He is in a full-time permanent position, and lives roughly an hour away, but very rarely visits the home. The caregiver moved to live with her grandmother when she was in grade 8, and then after matric, she had started working in a clothing shop, but once COVID came, she lost her job, then became pregnant, and has been caring for her gran ever since, and her son. Now, our work, and when we think about not just gendered inequalities, but the various work activities that are required in managing households and managing, both productive and reproductive work that is at the core of these 3 examples, but of the 100 households we work with in South Africa. If we look at the content of care work in older person households, and as I said, I've presented a few examples, performing care is gendered. We know that in South Africa, whether that's for children, people living with disabilities, or older persons. But managing care and the costs of care is also gendered. This slide shows the different ways in which management of cost is gendered work. And this, for example, I don't know if you can see this, it's quite small. Apologies for that. But we know, I think everyone here knows the common costs in households, the one being electricity, food, for example, funeral policies, and particularly for older persons, there may be medical products or incontinent products that are needed to be bought or at least acquired in some way. And so the households and the caregivers and the older persons explained how, over the last 2 or 3 years, with the increase in electricity costs, many people live often without access to electricity. This is really problematic for people who need either insulin or need oxygen for their various health needs. And this was an issue that was at the heart of many households. Not only that, but electricity costs take up at least 20% of the older person grant. So the way in managing this mainly by the caregivers was trying to get illegal connections, maybe to do extra work for top-ups in electricity. You might borrow money for topping up electricity. You might request obviously money from kin, even though those family members may be not forthcoming with support. You might also kind of stagger income and payments. So managing your money in ways that you prioritize electricity now, and maybe you delay the payment of something else in lieu of that. Now, in terms of food security, we saw that very, very explicitly that food for children, and particularly lunch boxes, are prioritized. I think child support grant is allocated fundamentally in the 100 households that we work with to children and to their school costs. That's both transport and food at school. But what was kind of coming up, and the challenges with regards to food security, was that certain people were eating too much, that certain people who had certain conditions were eating too much, but actually that the food costs, and particularly in relation to the increase in food costs, were taking up at least 50% of the older person's grant. People talk about the cost of having teenagers, and different types of people in the household. And so what people did in managing these costs was, and again, this is dependent on where you're living and whether there are these services available, was that many households who had food programs in the neighborhood would move between different food programs in managing the costs of food and acquiring food in their weekly kind of routine. Again, they would request support from family members or neighbors. They might offer in trade for certain services from the neighbors. They would get credit from the spaza shop. But most frequently, we saw how older persons, or the caregivers of older persons, and particularly caregivers who are coexisting, looking after older persons and children, would shield and eat less, for example, to manage the cost of having to acquire more food for themselves. Other people would hide food or keep it in different houses to allocate it specifically for the older person so that other people wouldn't get it. In relation to food policies, the ways of, it was definitely a priority. Funeral policies were paid first before anything else, often before food, and it often used up at least 20% of the older person's grant. What was deeply problematic was the acquiring of incontinence products for older persons who need them. And whilst this is meant to be freely available at clinics in almost all areas that we worked in, that's 7 sites across the 3 provinces, the clinics had very irregular, if not absolutely no provision of incontinent products for the last 6 or 7 months, for example, that we heard more recently. And so older persons and their families had to purchase these products, and these products are incredibly expensive. They were, for example, a 230 Rand for 10 incontinence products. That is about 10% of the older person's grant, as you know, but that only lasts for 5 days. So people were devising strategies of how to manage those costs and manage those products in ways that they wouldn't have to spend so much money. And all of that is care work. It's also managing the costs so that you can provide care, and that managing the cost so that you can provide either food, electricity, or a product in this case. Some of our material also speaks to the kind of other costs and the other inequalities or concerns that people had in relation to their caregiving activities, and that they gave up employment or stopped seeking employment because of the demands on them for caregiving. Again, this doesn't say that they don't want to be caregivers, but without any adequate support for caregivers of people who are living with particularly, multiple chronic conditions and have high care needs, it's impossible for caregivers to have an extra or additional form of employment. And the different people here depicted it in different ways. Some, as I said, left work, others were prevented from looking for work. The other impact, and where we see inequalities arising and divisions, particularly for women, and as I said, dominant caregivers were women, is in their own relationships with their own, let's say, spouses, children, or other kin members. So the impact that full-time caregiving for an older person had on their relationship, let's say with their spouse or with their own social worlds. And that led to quite a lot of isolation and anxiety and depression amongst many caregivers. Again, it doesn't say that the people still didn't want to, be the primary caregiver. With almost no support for caregivers, either in social support or, financial support or practical support, the demands on caregivers for managing quite complex care needs is immense. So in essence, what we're saying here is that, the SDGs, we see the high levels of gendered care work, gendered, racialized, and classed care work taking place. We see the forms of social protection that are the main form of support, particularly in the absence of long-term care. So long-term care, as I've mentioned, is family care in not just South Africa, but in Southern Africa. And there is a belief and a reliance on gendered family care. There's a deep conservative ideology. And whilst I don't think many people would expect anything else, the expectation that some of this work should be seen as valuable, and should be recognized. And what's happening here is we see, generational issues and gendered and generational issues being compounded, and the inequalities being compounded, both through a caregiver, an older person lens, but also through a care receiver. So caregivers, don't get me wrong, can also be older persons themselves. That was quite common in our sample. So in the absence, and with scant formal care services, there's very little public policy support for any form of home-based care. There's immense pressure and expectation and demand on families. And whilst there is a social grant for older persons who are in quote unquote regular need of attendance, the grant in aid, and we're currently doing more ethnographic work in that regard, and we'll be releasing a report by the end of the year on this. It's a extremely low uptake, although there are very exciting initiatives taking place in KZN in that regard. So LTC, long-term care, in the context of social protection, is basically seen as as pensions. But we know with the huge gaps in the safety nets that are available, and with multi-generational living, pensions alone are not enough. And so one of my recent publications that I wrote with Dr. Kelly looked at these struggles and tensions that exist between differently placed women, largely within households, within communities, and across the country on managing care of older persons. I hope that as I've been, I've alluded to all the different points. I do have one or two other aspects in relation to methods and older person, like household income. If anyone should have questions, I can go through that after in the chat. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Elena. Thank you so much for the very informative and insightful presentation, on the thing of gender equality, and specifically, with what you're presenting, about gender equality and care of older persons in Southern Africa. Just to, a question rather, I just wanted to ask, do you think rather gender equality, specifically on what you were discussing, do you think it also escalates SDG 3, which is good health and well-being? Do you think it also accelerates that SDG 3?
Should I respond? Yeah.
Yes.
Absolutely. In what we see at household level, in working with families, we see that older persons who are living with multiple chronic conditions and have quite a complex care needs, and we work across a range of households that have different care needs, but everyone does have care needs, and we see that people are not getting access to basic services. So, for example, we have many households where the older person has had a stroke, albeit at 60 or at 75, and following the stroke, they receive absolutely no rehabilitation services, which one might think is a luxury, but I hope we don't. But not only that, but they also don't receive a wheelchair or adequate kind of assessment of their houses and their spaces to see what other forms of support might be necessary. So because of the limited social work kind of services in the communities and absolutely no almost OT services, those kinds of support structures are not available unless you're connected to some NPO that has those types of supports, available at a kind of a common location. And there we obviously see those sometimes at urban areas, particularly in Johannesburg or in Cape Town, but they're not or Durban, for example, but they're not everywhere. So we see older persons living with care needs that they didn't need to have, and they're through the neglect of state support, either through the health system or the kind of primary healthcare system. They're not getting attended to in accessing not just health services, but also social services. So, for example, currently, and I mentioned the ethnographic work that we're doing, because we saw such a low uptake in the grant and aid, we decided to assist all the families we thought might be eligible, because you do need to have in regular need of assistance. We decided to assist them in applying for this particular grant. It's a 6-step process, right? And so, you need to have your wits about you to be able to go to SASSA 6 times, given what we know about SASSA and then the waiting and all of those things, particularly if you have high care needs, which this grant is targeted to for people who have high care needs. So I think in relation to your question, we see that it is the gendered inequalities, because we know not only about numbers, but we know that women in particular have many responsibilities in their lives, and so attending to their own needs isn't always at the forefront of their day or of their week. It isn't always their priority, and they may overlook, for obvious reasons, not just because of economic, for other activities or for other reasons, attending to these things. And we see the lack of services being a real problem, particularly in relation to strokes, but also in managing diabetes to prevent a stroke, for example, or hypertension. And so, yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Yes, it does answer my question, and thank you so much about that. Thank you so much for clarifying and just being very detailed with that question. There is further questions in the chat box, and I don't know if there's any more questions as well. You may raise your hand, and I may indicate to the indicator. It's rather a comment, probably says, thank you for highlighting how social and cultural norms or perceptions and limited implementation of policies can contribute towards long-term disadvantages at a multi-generational level. And there is a question by Prof. Mazibuko which says, thank you, Professor Moore, for your presentation. Your stats showed KZN with 31% older person who are grant beneficiaries. My question is, how were you able to succeed in explaining and understanding the cultural languages and health dynamics of this population?
Okay, well, I'll answer that one first. So we work in teams, right? So even in this, obviously we're working in teams across the 4 countries, but even in South Africa, we only go into people's houses where the teams are speaking and are from that particular area, or when I say area, like broader area, not obviously we're from every single community. So my colleague, Dr. Nonzuzo Mobakazi, has been working in KZN for many years. She did her PhD in 3 of the areas that we're currently working in KZN. She knows the landscape. She knows, obviously not all of the families, but she knows the communities. She knows the social workers, and she knows her grandmother is from one of those areas, for example. So that we work in teams because we don't think, and similarly, whether it's in Cape Town, in Khayelitsha, or whether it's in East River, or whether it's in Goodwood, we're never going to have all the skills and the necessary personal knowledge or experiential knowledge for understanding household dynamics. Sometimes it's useful to be from the area. Obviously, it's essential in many ways, but sometimes it's also to be good not to be from the area. People often, reveal more to outsiders than they do to insiders. But we have a combination. We always work in teams. So we always, first of all, work in twos. And we always make sure that the people who are working in families, myself included, obviously speak the local language of that family. And So I hope that answers that question.
Perfect.
There was another question. So I think, is it in the chat?
Yes, it's in the chat. I don't know if you want to attend the chat first or the hands raised.
I'm just trying to look for that question that was in the chat. I think I've skipped it.
Okay, yeah. So the question says, thank you, Professor Moore. This was also another informative session. I don't know if I missed it, but when you looked at caregiving, did you mostly look at women? I have an uncomfortable question. I am a Black person and we tend to look after our older persons, but I always wondered, why do the whites not do the same? I'm just asking, as I always wondered on this one.
I'm not laughing. I mean, okay, so we purposely didn't want to only speak to female caregivers. We tried our best to get male caregivers, and we have many. I can show you if you want, our sample breakdown. It's on our website, and it's very clear. The reason is you don't find many, you won't be able to find as many male caregivers as female just because they're not there. It's not because they don't exist. So we do have, I think, out of our 100, if I'm top of my head, I think we have at least 18 male caregivers. But we also have male care recipients, i.e. the older persons are men. And that was also really important for us because we know there is that expectation that people will say, an older woman can't be washed, for example, by a man or vice versa. And we also had a member of our team who was a man. We only have one, but who we made sure that when possible and when, we could match the researcher gendered wise with our participant. Obviously that wasn't possible in all cases. But to answer your question, it's not true that all whites, don't have family members looking after them. I think what you might be getting at is that, first of all, so we work in a white area in Cape Town where all the family members are looking after the older persons. It's a class-based issue too. Okay, so obviously we know the history of the country and we know that residential care homes were whites only in their beginning. And that legacy still continues because those residential homes are in specific areas. And whilst those areas are technically, desegregated, they're still largely white only. So for example, in KZN, there's a very few residential care homes. So you have a population of about 1 million people, of which there's only 3,000 care homes and places in care homes. It's tiny, right? But that has its historical colonial legacy and apartheid legacy where those homes weren't built and therefore they didn't exist there. We all know the reasons for that. And so there is a practice and a history of having old age homes available to whites only. Obviously, colored and Indian people were able to access old age homes also much earlier in the 50s and 60s and 70s. And the thing is, all of those old age homes are also only subsidized. They're not free. There's almost no free old age homes in the country. So either your pension gets taken away from you and you still have to pay in. So the reality is that, for the white family, I should say of the 100 families we work with, only 2 families were able to pay for care, i.e. had someone come into the house in the private like space of a house and paid for someone, and both of those were Black South African families. And you need to have a lot of money and access to a lot of money to be able to afford that, or you need to be able to get access to money, I should say, not just have the money yourself. So a lot of white families, we didn't work with a single family that has the resources. I mean, obviously I said there was 2 families that did have a paid caregiver. The one family could only have it for 2 months, and then they couldn't afford it any longer. So none of our families were in the position to pay for care. That doesn't deny that there are many households in South Africa who can and do pay for care, most of whom are white families, but not only white families. I think if we looked at none of our works look at market-based care provision. I think it's a very important piece of work to do. It is the minority of the forms of care provision that exist in the country. And we look obviously at family caregiving for obvious reasons, because it's the dominant form. I hope that answers that question.
Yeah, I think it does. Thank you so much, Dr. Elena. There is a comment rather again in the chat section, says, thank you so much for this presentation. The family case studies powerful evoke the complex realities of older persons and caregivers and the strategies they develop in order to survive.
Sorry, have we lost? Hello?
Hello?
Yeah, sorry, I wasn't sure if it was if you couldn't hear me or I couldn't hear you.
Yes, I can hear you. There is a hand raised by Zamogoshe. You may unmute and speak.
Thank you so much. This has been a really, really, really engaging and interesting presentation. Thank you so much, Professor Moore. It's triggering this communication between my brain and my heart, and I'll try my best to articulate myself as best as I can, because as you were going through the statistics and the narratives that you collected through your study, I couldn't help but remember this, or just think about the precarity of being a Black body in South Africa.
Mm-hmm.
And how that centralizes for me in the way that I think about things. It centralizes our lived experience. For example, I was born in the township. I grew up there, and I was like many other people in my neighborhood or my social setting. We were raised by our grandparents because our parents had to leave to go find work to try and mitigate that economic gap, and for that I've this very close relationship around elderly people and the care that they need. So I'm really passionate about this and thinking around the economic, but also looking at the historic reasons for why the elderly people, specifically Black elderly people, need specific types of care is because of, you'd hear narratives of where they used to work, the conditions at which they used to work under, and how these are now manifesting in health disparities and in other health ill healths, maybe, if I can say that, in the current day, right? And how within those contexts, we know that in let us say townships and also in rural areas, they usually only have primary health care facilities, which is clinics. However, the type of care that is needed there for some of the elderly people, they need some of the sophisticated machinery and specialists and all of that, which are not available in the context in which we're in. But also more broadly, there are no streetlights, there's no water, there's no access to clean water to use, to drink, to cook with. All of these things come together and they just form a clump. So that's some of the comments that came into my mind and some of the feelings that as I was engaging with your presentation came to me. Although as you were doing the research, a question that came to my mind was, in your engagement and looking at South Africa, and I'm not sure about the statistics in other countries, but South Africa has over 80% Black, right? And within that, I was wondering how if you use the lens of indigenous knowledge systems to engage with the concept of elderly care and how that involves, how that kind of creates a more nuance in the engagement, particularly because while with Western lens, we'll think around, and perhaps maybe even convenience, we'll think around elderly people need to leave the home and go to specialized places of care. However, within indigenous knowledge systems, we understand that the family kind of builds around the eldest person that was there, and there's a specific need, and there are specific roles in which the eldest person in the family holds, particularly from childbirth rituals all the way till death rituals that the oldest person in the family needs to take care of and needs to make decisions around, and there's a specific reverence towards the eldest person in the family. On the other hand, we also find that there's this very scary narrative, and dare I say experiences that I've also seen firsthand of elderly people, particularly elderly women, who are accused of witchcraft by their neighborhoods or the neighbors and their communities, and they face a whole lot of harm, physical, emotional, social harms, and how that feeds into this gendered violence around elderly women particularly, you know. And I was wondering if there's any more you'd like to maybe engage with around the concept of using indigenous knowledge systems in understanding elderly care. I'm not sure if I was making a lot of sense there.
Thanks so much for that. If I can respond now, because there was quite a bit there. I completely agree, with you mentioned yourself, the precarity of being a Black body. These are life histories. So when we work with the older person, we do listen to their life history in the beginning, although it's not as detailed as what I would like to, as a complete biography. We do see how someone has moved through their lives in terms of their work, in terms of their personal lives, in terms of the country and the geography and the history. And you're right, they often do lead to particular illnesses, to particular conditions, particular forms of work. I mean, to be honest, 30 or 40 years ago, we wouldn't even be having this conversation because most people didn't even make it. It sounds very crude of me to say that, but most people didn't always make it to that old age because of the nature of work, and work was so dangerous for many, and that's still the case for many. So we do that. We do incorporate, the kind of a life history and a cumulative disadvantage understanding of the person's particular situation now and their particular, physicality right now. In terms of what you were saying about access to services in, like whether it's access in a rural area to better healthcare, it doesn't have to be a rural area. It could be obviously, a part of the city. We've seen that all the time. We see how people are living with conditions, we're living with the need for it. We obviously don't know what the need is because we're not necessarily doctors. But the minute we support that person in trying to access better services, they get it. Because what is needed is, and we're not medical doctors, and we're not trying to be. We're not trying to understand the nature of the condition per se. What we want to support with and what we want to see is that people can access the healthcare that they need, whether that's in a tertiary, healthcare facility, or whether that's at the primary healthcare level. That's not for us to determine, needless to say. But what we see is that people aren't getting access in ways that are helping them live, with dignity. And I can give you many examples. I don't think I need to give you the examples, but there are examples recently where we've had to support families, and I say had to, we wanted to support families on multiple occasions by going back to the clinic, and only for, and I say ours, we're a team, the presence of our researchers, I suspect, helped people get better access, needless to say. One, because of transport, two, because of social capital and networks and other kind of dynamics that we all know about, right? You talked about 80% of the population being Black and the indigenous elderly systems, engaged in care, and you spoke about multiple things here, particularly in relation to care. We funnily enough, we do ask all our participants, whether they're old or young, and whether they're black or white, or whether they're, you know, colored or Indian. We ask them about what an older person should do who wants to stay at home, but whose oldest son thinks she should move in with him because she's at risk of falling, for example, right? And so many responses are the older person's wishes need to be prioritized. And many of the lived experiences is that older person wish to stay in a, you know, let's say it doesn't have to be a rural area, but in a particular area where they are potentially at risk of being less seen to or less visible. But that's their choice, and that choice is often respected and it's often prioritized. We also, on the other thing, you talked about, like, for example, the eldest son, and he is meant to do these things. We have many caregivers, particularly daughters, and particularly not only daughters, nieces, for example, granddaughters, saying that it wasn't my responsibility. It doesn't mean, again, that they don't want to do it, but they did say that the other kin members who are meant to at least take lead on this responsibility weren't or didn't. And that's where we see there are a lot of tensions within families about who's doing, not just making decisions, but who's doing the kind of daily management of care, whether you can pay for it or not, whether you do it yourself or not, and who's involved. And so we draw family maps around the older person, including neighbors or anyone else who's relevant, you know, in that person's life. And we see that actually the number of people who are actively helping in ways that are, you know, important to the older person is actually quite small, even though there are many other people around. And I don't mean just around physically, you know. So the other point you raised was around the accusation of witchcraft. And this it actually hasn't been very well documented, although it is a common theme that pops up, not in the literature, but in conversations around elderly abuse, particularly in the region and in South Africa specifically. And it's obviously linked often to levels of dementia and cognitive decline and the links between the two. And you're right, the levels of harm that may occur the older person who is alleged to, you know, to be engaging in witchcraft, but maybe actually experiencing different forms of cognitive decline or dementia or Alzheimer's or whatever it may be, is deeply problematic. We haven't looked at that specifically, needless to say. You know, it hasn't come up in our sample. That doesn't to say it doesn't exist, but there are seminars, and we did try and run a seminar on it. And there is a small bit of literature, mainly from someone who worked on it in their PhD like about 10 years ago, and I can forward that paper, and it's an article to you if you want. Vanessa, maybe, sorry. I hope that responds, and thanks for the comments.
Okay, thank you so much.
Yes, you did. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Prof. Melissa, your hand is raised. You may unmute and ask away.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Prof, for your presentation. So the gendered nature of unpaid care work is obviously a huge feminist issue. But I don't want to really go into that now. I thought some of the comments and the questions were excellent around how do we address this. For me, it's about linking this to the SDGs. And I wanted to find out from you, in the light of all the things that you mentioned around colonialism and apartheid, the socio-economic realities that these created and are now being exacerbated through austerity policies forced on us by the neo-imperial, neoliberal, dominant geopolitical economic models that are in the world right now. I'm looking at solutions and integrating the interlinking factors besides no poverty, zero hunger, etc. I'm looking at other interlinking factors, such as, for example, unfair trade policies, monetary policies where our rand is devaluated against the dollar and we have to import a machine at X amount of money that we can't afford. So for me, I'm linking it to these kinds of things. So how do we create enabling environments so we don't have just merely a case of obligations on the state for provision of care, right? Where the state takes the role of the community, so to speak, right? Where they become the caregiver, so that we relieve women, because this is what tends to happen, that we relieve women particularly poor women, of the burden of unpaid care work. What are the solutions? If we talk about sustainable development, what are the solutions that we are proffering? I mean, obviously, one of my key things is reparations. We need to look at that seriously if we want to actually get ourselves out of the quagmire of the current economic situation we find ourselves in. But did you even when you make? I'm sure you made recommendations. When you made the recommendations, did you take these things into consideration? Because it's not going to change overnight. Never mind the so-called social cultural barriers such as gender discrimination, but actually very serious economic and structural barriers that we have to face given our history of colonialism and apartheid. Just perhaps a word or two on that. Thank you very much. Thanks for a really interesting presentation. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thanks, Vanessa. That's a fantastic question. And I should say, we've been publishing reports, but we're not at the end point at all by any means yet. And I can't share now in the chat all the different reports, but I can send it on later and it can be shared. There are a range of things we are seeing internationally and elsewhere that will be really, really exciting to try to get to grips with. And like you say, we don't believe the state can do it all, and we also don't believe the families can do it all. Communities are an essential part of the story, and where we see NPOs, doing fantastic things where they are well resourced and high functioning because of their resources, they're able to do a lot. The problem is they're often donor funded. They're often, you don't know whether they're going to still be around in 5 years' time because of donor funding and etc. So what we're seeing is there are programs in Brazil, for example, that are co-funded through municipalities, through other kind of sources, through the Treasury and through others, specific programs that are about neighborhood level and a community level home-based care, which relieves family carers of the around the clock demand on them, and gives support. So, for example, we have many caregivers who are in their 50s and they're looking after their mother who are in their 80s, right? And they say, I'm going out to work. I work in a textile factory. I get paid X amount. I commute for 3 hours. I'd much prefer to be going around the community and helping 10 older persons. I could do 2 hours and 2 hours and 2 hours. They're giving us solutions. People on the ground are giving us solutions. The question is, how do you finance that? How does it work? What are the methods that you could use and look towards? The one thing in relation to your question that I do think, and I have put this forward in our reports that we've done, I analysed 20 years of state funding of old age, of elderly care. And what we have seen is a defunding of community care over time, at least 13%, right? But what we see is residential care homes eating up the budget. 80% of a province's budget on older persons goes to a residential care home. And as I said, they only serve a tiny fraction of the population, most of whom are white. So I have argued for, not that we want to get rid of old age homes, but we may want to rethink the financing structure of our national spending, of our spending basically, and what services are funded and how. I think your idea around other mechanisms, such as reparations, are fantastic. I know, for example, when we look outside of South Africa and we see, well, even within South Africa, we see trade wars, like you mentioned, or unfair trade policies taking place where, for example, Namibia just opened up the border to maize imports from Angola because of the drought. And we suddenly see that older persons now have access to food, and the food price of maize in Namibia has just kind of leveled off and had been rising rapidly to the point where older persons couldn't afford food, and the same is going to be true for food deals between Botswana and South Africa. And these macroeconomic, and I do say macroeconomic, challenges are ways of rethinking how we can make care sustainable, not just elderly care, but care more broadly. I do think there has to be a recognition of this care work. It's not sustainable to put it on families unpaid and invisible. How we do it, there are models that are in existence in Vietnam, in Thailand, and in Brazil that are highly functioning. That can be particularly the Brazilian one, could be adopted with specific, context, obviously. But it's always going to come back to funding structures, isn't it? That's really often what it boils down to. And if we think that the elder care sector is one of the least transformed. So for example, the food scheme for children is funded through Treasury through a particular grant. It doesn't come through the Department of Basic Education. It comes through a particular grant made directly by Treasury for this specific item. And that's where I think we need to go for elderly care or parts of elderly care. But that's going into funding allocations rather than, I think, conceptual questions that you're asking about who needs to pay for the disadvantage, the cumulative disadvantages that have, occur today, that have origins in their past, and what are the sources thereof, and how can we improve that? But I'd love to chat to you more about this. It would be fantastic. Thanks, Vanessa.
Thanks, Vanessa. Thank you, Prof. I hope your question is answered, Vanessa. Thank you so much. Is there anyone else with a question? If you have a question for Prof, or any last comments before we end the session, or anybody with a comment for any of our speakers, just in closing, just before we close our session. Anybody with a question, probably a final comment? Okay, yeah, please unmute and speak. Erica.
Good afternoon, and thank you very much. I have to confess that this is a topic I haven't spent much time thinking about. Isn't that terrible, considering I have an 89-year-old father? But what I wanted to share with you is that in Portugal, you can see from the surname, I'm married to a Portuguese guy, and they have a system where they would prefer the elderly to live at home because they said it's far better. It's actually better for all the family members. But if you do have somebody, an elderly person living in your home, you get a subsidy from the government. They also have a system where you can actually drop off. So like kindergarten, but now it's for the elderly. You can actually drop off your grandparent at a
daycare. It's called daycare.
During the day, and then they get fed. They're with their and also please know that most of those people have never left that village, and they play cards with their friends, or they just read if they're not able to speak anymore. They just watch what happens outside, and then they get fed. And then at the end of the day, when most of the time it is the woman collects them from the home and then takes them back to their actual house. So it's a completely different system, and they've got an aging population, and it's huge. But just a quick add on what happens perhaps elsewhere in the world. But thank you very, very much.
Thanks, Erica. I mean, aging in place is the concept that you're referring to, where we know and we all agree that people want to stay in their homes. It's it dominates. The problem is staying in one home is not the same as staying in another home, and many homes are disabling. And I don't mean home; I mean like a person's own home. And so the structures and support services that are offered in different countries for different reasons, may exist here. Daycare is offered here. The problem in South Africa is that daycare is offered in a handful of places that are largely, white areas or linked to a residential care home. And for example, 80,000 older persons in South Africa can access a service centre. That's 80,000 out of almost 6 million. So you're always talking about a very, very small minority who are either fit enough or who happen to have one in the area, which is not the case for the vast majority of the people. So in Limpopo, in Mpumalanga, in Northern Province, there's almost none. So that's why I started with, it's highly uneven. Access to resources for older persons is highly uneven across the country. And with that comes, and hence it's really untransformed in many ways, both in the past, but obviously in the current. So these kinds of practices do exist in South Africa. It's just they're unequal, including daycare that you're referring to. But thanks for that, Erica.
Thank you so much, Erica, for sharing that with us. Thank you so much again, Prof. Elena. Just in closing, is there anybody else before we can close the session that has any comment or any question for any of our three speakers today? If you have any comment or rather a final question that you'd like to ask, please just indicate before we may end the session. Or is there any comment from any of our speakers? If you'd like to say anything, any last comments? There is a hand raised by Zamobusha. You may go ahead.
Thank you. I think my last thought would be directed to Professor Eleanor Moore. And I was thinking if with the challenges and the lack of resources that we're currently facing in our context as South Africa, and I think it extends broadly to sub-Saharan Africa as previous colonies, I was wondering if there is a way to perhaps catalyze the move towards a remembering of collectivist living instead of the individualistic approach to life, and if that would have any impact on how we care for the elderly and perhaps the standard of living within the different contexts. For example, if communities came together and regardless of there being a specific dedicated thing, but the whole community comes together and takes care of each other again. I know it sounds like a utopia, but I was just thinking around solutions.
That's a fantastic idea, you know, and it does exist in different places, and not just in different communities here, but obviously in different parts of the world. You can have everything from what are called care farms, where people go and tend to the gardens, but also to themselves, like to each other. And part in Botswana, actually, many of their extended work programs for older persons is about that. It's about actually getting out and you know, engaging in, let's say, gardening or agricultural work or whatever it might be, to actually socialize and have companionship and to look after one another and be there for one another. You also see it obviously in smaller collectives. You do see wider kin members looking after each other, you know, not just families but also neighbors. We see that extensively, actually, you know, where a neighbor is lending a hand, is donating food, and all of those things. I think you know, to have it organized is another level of structure that would be brilliant. And obviously Federici and others call for this, you know, Sylvia Federici in her work. What we do see happening is quite a lot of tension within differently placed carers. So between family carers, you know, paid carers, social workers, etc. And I think part of the lack of resourcing at a state level leads to kind of fights and tensions and conflict between people on the ground. And I've written on that, and I can share that reading with you. But you know, your suggestion is wholeheartedly accepted. There's really good examples and really exciting examples, even where you have things like in a ShopRite, you'll have a corner where people can just sit and have tea, you know, and just chat. And it's not expensive, it's not difficult. People are going there anyway. Obviously, you may be, you know, limited to those who can get there, but there are these different examples that do exist. And I think NOAH is an NPO here in Cape Town that is doing quite a lot of that type of work. They are a very well-resourced NPO. It's not the norm, but it does allow them to engage in kind of social housing, collective housing. You know, we visited houses and families, and they're not families, they're social housing structures where you have 10 older persons and their loved ones, let's say, all co-residing. And that worked out really well when it worked out really well. It doesn't say it wasn't free of tensions either. There was still fights like any, you know, group of people would have fights. But it did seem to make sense, you know. And that's an old structure that existed from the 70s in Cape Town. That was obviously previously white only, but has expanded. And actually, though, unfortunately, is being shut down because of rising property prices, that people want to sell off the land rather than allocating it to social housing. It's a very interesting topic if you are interested in it specifically in relation to housing. But thanks for the comment, and it's wholeheartedly accepted. And I'll bring to the fore some of these activities and some of these programs that do exist. Thanks.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, Prof. Thank you so much again, Sibukuhle. Is there any other comments or any last words from our speakers? Dr. Vanesh, is there anything you'd like to say? Dr. Zamambo, is there anything that you'd like to say before I can close the session, or any other comments from anybody?
I just wanted to say thank you so much, Lawrence, for inviting me and for this very interesting conversation we just had. And thank you to everyone who attended as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much again for honoring our invite. To all our speakers, Prof. Elena Moore and Dr. Zamambo and Dr. Pillay, and here the RCD unit at the University of Johannesburg. Really appreciate you, to come out and speak on this SDG 5 gender equality, as the SDG plays a vital role in always shaping a better future for all, and to offer a vision of sustainable and equitable world and provide a roadmap in achieving this vision of the SDG. As the UN central promise of the SDG is to never leave no one behind in the progress towards a just and prosperous and peaceful world. And with that, again, I'd like to thank all the attendees, all the participants, and all the colleagues, and obviously our panel experts, Dr. Vanesh again, Dr. Zamambo, and Prof. Elena. And thank you again for honoring our invite to speak and to deliberate more on this SDG 5. And we really appreciate your presence and all the knowledge. It was very informative, very insightful, very educative, and all the stats that you provided, regarding this SDG 5. And hopefully, we can work together again in the future. And thank you again to everybody. And just a reminder that I posted the feedback survey in the chat box, and I'd like to request everybody to fill it in so that we may get insights on how useful this workshop was and how we can improve as well in the future. And also we use this for our RCD reporting, and also we send this feedback to our presenters and our speakers as well. So without any waste of time, thank you so much again. And with that, I will close this session. And thank you again to everybody, and have yourself a good day further. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.